Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for the Unpacking the Status of Wolves webinar. My name is Allie Fisher, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm the Wildlife and EDI Associate for Oregon Wildlife Program Coordinator Danielle Moser and Northeast Oregon Field Coordinator Rob Clavens will provide a thorough overview of the status of wolf protections, share opportunities for you to provide public comment, and more. I would also like to include a land acknowledgement in this space. I would like to offer gratitude to the land itself and those who have lived here in Oregon since time immemorial. I'd like to acknowledge not only the forests, rivers, mountains, and deserts that those of us at Oregon Wild celebrate and work to conserve, but also places of art and industry, science, commerce, and community that are built upon these lands. I would like to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples on the land today, as well as historical events, including colonial legacies and wrongdoings like forced removal that have had long-lasting and current impacts. Additionally, a recording of this program will be emailed out tomorrow and will be posted on our website, OregonWild.org, in the Wild blog. Please enter your questions at any time, since we usually do get a flood of questions right at the end of the presentation. The sooner you can get yours in, the easier it will be for us to organize and answer them after the presentation is done. If you bought a raffle ticket, thank you. Your support allows us to continue putting on these webinars and the other work that we do. If you'd like to enter the raffle, it will be open for the rest of tonight, and we are offering some special prizes. As you can see here, we have the book Journey about the wolf OR7. We have our Wild Pride merch, and then we have this special glass enamel on silver wolf pin. That's really cute. Lastly, make sure to RSVP for a webinar on October 27th on hiking the Oregon Coast Trail. You can find this online at OregonWild.org. And now I will pass it off to Rob.
All right, let me just share my screen here. Presentation. So can you see that nice picture?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thanks, Allie. I am Rob Clavens, the Northeast Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild. I live in Wallowa County, just outside of Enterprise and really near to the Eagle Cap Wilderness. We're really lucky to live in a place like this near hundreds of thousands of acres of public lands and actually as full a complement of native wildlife here as any place in the state. And we also live on what was promised to be the reservation of the Nez Perce or Nimiipuu, who have called much of this region home since time immemorial, with evidence of human habitation going back 16,000 years. And I assume a number of you have seen versions of our presentations before and want to recognize that there's probably a lot of variation regarding what folks do and don't know about wolves. So with some apologies, I'm going to go over some things pretty quickly. We did do a webinar about a year ago that was much heavier on wolves, ecology, and wolf stories. So if you want to take a deeper dive into that, you can find it on our blog and our YouTube page. This time, though, I think we're going to get into some pretty detailed and maybe even dry stuff because we're at just a really critical moment for wolves, and this is meant to be a call for action. And of course, we want to save some time for Q&A at the end because that's always, I think, the best part. So there's a lot of myth and misinformation out there about wolves, and that's in part because we haven't been studying them scientifically for very long. And some of the first wolf researchers were pretty old school in their attitudes about the value of wildlife. Thankfully, those attitudes are being challenged now by the scientific community and society at large. And one of the things is that we've learned that if wolves have food and we don't kill them, they can do well in nearly any habitat. Wolves are hunters, and to a lesser extent, they're scavengers who will eat just about anything. And that's why we see wolves in Minnesota eating moose and beaver. In Wisconsin and Michigan, they primarily eat deer. And here in the West, it's elk. And there were even some recent observations of wolves in Hell's Canyon area out here gorging on a grasshopper explosion. Wolves have a social structure that's very much like our own human family units. And as our understanding of that social structure has evolved, we've seen that it has huge implications. Wolves are very different than other wildlife, so the idea of managing them like other species may sound appealing, but it's fundamentally flawed. And setting aside ethical questions, killing wolves often has ripple effects with unintended consequences, which is why the paradigm of killing wolves as the primary management tool, like it is for most wildlife, is generally counterproductive. In a lot of presentations, we address anti-wolf misinformation, and we don't really have time for that today, but suffice it to say, wolves are a native species that coexisted with their prey here for millennia. They're generally not a threat to humans and have minimal impacts on the livestock industry as a whole. And where there might be sort of more acute impacts, they can almost always be addressed in ways other than killing, but it takes some effort. In addition to being a native species, wolves are a flagship species, which is to say that they help make people care about conservation and ecological integrity in a way that less charismatic species may not. They're an umbrella species, which means that if we can protect the integrity of the landscape that wolves and their prey need, we're likely doing a lot to help the rest of the plants, animals, and functions of that landscape. And finally, wolves are a keystone species. So much like beaver or sea otters or humans, wolves have a disproportionate effect on their ecosystems. For wolves, Yellowstone is the most famous example. And as that research has been evolving, it's getting more and more complicated. But all of it continues to just reinforce the notion that whether we understand it or not, all the parts of the ecosystem play an important role. And as Aldo Leopold cautioned us, it's wise to have some humility and to keep all the pieces in function. And we also know that wolves have positive economic value. And that's something I can speak to personally. My wife and I own and operate a working farm and bed and breakfast. And a lot of our guests ask about wildlife. They especially ask about birds, wolves, and wolverine. They come out here for the natural beauty, for wildlife, public lands, and these intact landscapes, or mostly intact landscapes. They don't come to look at cow pastures or trampled streams or logged forests or mining operations. And when they're here, they spend their money at all sorts of businesses, from art stores and outfitters to gas stations, and even buying and eating locally raised meat. And we know we're not alone. Study after study has shown that protected public lands and abundant wildlife have positive impacts on rural communities throughout the West. But I think for most of us, wildlife has a value that's independent of what economics or ecological science tells us. I know that I don't want to live in a world where native wildlife can't thrive beyond sort of token persecuted populations or postage stamp landscapes. And an overwhelming majority of Americans feel that way, even if it's hard to quantify or articulate why. And I think that includes wildlife that challenges us. And no doubt, carnivores like wolves challenge these very long-standing and strongly held core identities regarding manifest destiny, humanity's mastery over nature, or the idea that nature is full of resources that are for us and for us to maximize solely for our benefit. But like Molly Beatty said about wolf recovery, what a country chooses to save is what a country chooses to say about itself. And I think that on this, our country is evolving in the right direction. It's just time for policymakers and agencies to start catching up. So wolves were once the widest ranging non-human land mammal on the planet, with a range that covered most of North America, including Oregon. However, European colonists brought about a purposeful campaign of extermination of native peoples and wildlife, including wolves. And with the exception of northeastern Minnesota, they were successful in systematically exterminating wolves from the lower 48 through a government-assisted campaign of bounties, shooting, poisoning, and trapping. Thankfully, though, before it was too late for wolves, we had an environmental awakening that included enshrining the idea that we would not allow species to go extinct and, in fact, try to recover them where we could. And that was done through the Endangered Species Act in 1974. Under those protections, wolves began expanding their range. And even here in the Western United States, wolves were making a natural recovery on their own in places like northwestern Montana. In 1995, that process was accelerated by moving several dozen wolves into Yellowstone National Park and with the help of the Nez Perce tribe, central Idaho. So going back again in time, Oregon followed the same path as much of the rest of the United States. In fact, when a bunch of white male landowners couldn't agree on much else, they were able to agree that they needed to organize to eliminate native carnivores. And those meetings were called the Wolf Meetings and ultimately led to the creation of the state of Oregon. And interestingly, or maybe morbidly, as recently as my last visit to the state capitol, the quote in this slide was emblazoned on a display as you walked into the hearing rooms where the fate of wolves were still being decided primarily by white men with a narrow and exploitative view of the natural world. The last wolf bounty in Oregon was collected in 1947. There may have been some wolves that lingered or showed up after that, but for all intents and purposes, they were functionally extirpated from the state around the end of World War II. With the protection of the Endangered Species Act, though, it didn't take long for the wolves that returned to Yellowstone and central Idaho to regain a foothold. Just a couple of years later, a wolf known as B45 made her way into Oregon. And in response to hysteria from the usual suspects, she was darted by government agents, put into a crate, and sent back to Idaho. Tribal biologists thought that the process had actually killed her, but thankfully she survived to have an impressive legacy before being likely killed by a poacher. And if that's a story you're interested in, I strongly recommend checking out Jim Yuskovich's book In Wolf Country, which does a really great job telling it. The next few wolves that made their way into Oregon were killed by poachers and hit by cars. So in 2005, conservationists convinced ODFW that simply relocating endangered species to Idaho was not a conservation plan and likely was a violation of the law. So the state undertook a huge public process to create its first wolf plan. And I like to remind people that Oregon's wolf plan has never been a scientifically defensible conservation plan. It's a social and political compromise that overtly violates a great deal of the science that the plan itself cites. In any case, the plan has a lot of complexity, but the fundamental trade-off here was between those who wanted to set a low bar for when wolves could be killed and when protections could be eliminated. And on the other hand, scientists, conservationists, and the vast majority of the public argued that stronger and enduring protections that made killing of wolves truly an option of last resort. The ultimate compromise was that the threshold for when wolves could be killed included some well-intentioned sideboards, but that language was ambiguous and ultimately really ripe for abuse. On the other hand, the livestock industry got most of what they wanted in negotiating arbitrarily low thresholds for what recovery meant and when those protections could be loosened. And unlike the language on the conservation side, the things that they got were clearly defined in numerical terms. One other important part was that since we knew we had a lot to learn and we wouldn't get it right the first time, the plan included an automatic 5-year review. Unfortunately, despite compromises from conservationists, scientists, and the broad public, though, as soon as the plan was approved, the livestock industry and their political allies reneged and ultimately relentlessly introduced legislation to undermine the plan year after year for the better part of a decade. During that time, we did learn a lot in those first few years. Primarily, we learned and we continue to relearn that killing wolves generally makes problems worse and that ambiguity causes conflict. In 2010, the plan was reviewed, and despite thousands of public comments, as well as scientists and other experts weighing in on behalf of stronger protections, the state instead doubled down on ambiguity in the parts of the plan that created conflict. And instead, they weakened the plan from a conservation perspective. And that's a pattern that continues to this day. When they're not being ordered to do differently by a judge, ODFW has generally given themselves more and more discretion to kill wolves, and at times has been overtly hostile to the conservation community and the majority of Oregonians who don't hunt or run livestock on public lands. Sadly, the very next year, in 2011, wolves in Eastern Oregon were stripped of their protections under the Federal Endangered Species Act. At the time, there were 29 known wolves in the entire state of Oregon. And so going back in time to set this up, when wolves were reintroduced in 1995, the Fish and Wildlife Service created what they called a distinct population segment of experimental non-essential wolves in the area that you see delineated in the map here. And they set a very low minimum recovery goal that wolf opponents have willfully misrepresented as a population target as opposed to a minimum recovery goal. So under the Bush administration, the agency tried to delist wolves, but each effort was found to be illegal, and in large part because of the state plans that would likely drive wolves right back onto the endangered species list. In 2011, Democrats were really nervous about holding their majority in Congress. To hold the Senate, they needed Montana Democrat John Tester to hold his seat, and Tester in turn felt like he had to give something to far-right ideologues. And as so often happened, it turned out wolves would pay the price. So, well, the Democratic Party held firm on budget cuts to things like Planned Parenthood and NPR. With the blessing of the party and the president, a rider was attached to a must-pass budget bill that stripped protections from wolves in the Northern Rockies region, which included Eastern Oregon, where all of the state's 29 known wolves lived. And it was bad that enough that politicians had chosen to delist wolves as part of a budget battle and political calculation, but worse still, they included this unprecedented language that shielded the decision from legal review. And though it seemed to most of us like an unprecedented violation of just the most basic separation of powers, a judge refused to hear the case and the delisting stood. Literally hours later, under Oregon's weakened wolf plan and at the request of the livestock industry, ODFW issued kill orders for members of the Imnaha pack. And keep in mind, there were 29 wolves in 4 known packs in the entire state at that time. And I hope it's showing up, but this is a picture of what the entire Imnaha pack looked like at the time. And you can imagine what killing even a single wolf out of that pack would mean. For those of you who are familiar with Oregon, individual wolves in Oregon, the black collared wolf here is OR4, and the white female in front is OR2. Thankfully, though, the agency in this case was unsuccessful at killing these wolves under this particular order. In 2014, OR2 would go missing, and in 2016, ODFW shot OR4 and what remained of the Imnaha pack from a helicopter. And after that time, just again and again, after delisting, ODFW issued kill orders on behalf of the livestock industry. And as those orders started flowing, it seemed that every dead cow was blamed on wolves. Finally, in 2012, Oregon Wild, Cascadia Wildlands, and the Center for Biological Diversity took the state to court over the state's wolf killing program. A judge agreed that ODFW was likely violating the law, issued an injunction, and stopped the hunts. And while we felt confident that we were going to prevail, rather than continue in this winner-take-all legal battle, we offered to sit down with the state and the livestock industry and see if we could come to an agreement. It took 17 months of really challenging negotiations, but ultimately we got there. And in the end, we didn't fundamentally change the wolf plan, and it wasn't perfect, but what we did do was add clarity to the ambiguity in the conservation portions of the plan. The problem was that clarity only applied when wolves were very low in number. And while we're proud of what happened next, it was a mistake to trust that if it worked, the agency would learn from that success and not give in to political pressure at the next opportunity. So under the terms of the settlement, from 2012 to 2015, Oregon was the only state in the country with a meaningful wolf population that didn't kill them. And it wasn't because they didn't have the authority, but because with clear sideboards in place, they simply didn't have to. Even as the population of wolves grew, conflict with livestock decreased. And for the first time ever, the livestock industry was legally bound. Sorry, I went back there. The livestock industry was legally bound to stand by the plan. And with all of that in place, we saw what everybody says they want to see. The wolf population was recovering, livestock losses were down, and there was less human conflict. And that stood in really stark contrast to other states where we saw that killing wolves led to more dead cows, more dead wolves, and more angry people. And what's really interesting is that research has shown that's part of a pattern, largely because killing wolves disrupts their inter and intra-pack social structures. Killing wolves tends to increase predation on livestock. And even more interestingly, social researchers have also shown that legal killing of wolves does not increase tolerance at all. In fact, it only leads to more bloodlust and increases poaching. So wrapping up here, in 2015, the second 5-year plan review was triggered, and the growth in numbers also had consequences. In 2015, the wolf population met this politically driven recovery milestone from the original wolf plan that meant that the wolf plan moved into a new phase where all of the pre-settlement ambiguity returned. It also meant that ODFW could conduct a status review, which is to say, an assessment of whether or not wolves should be delisted, downlisted, or maintain their status as a state endangered species. And we argued that since the plan review was mandatory and that it provided a guide to the future, the required plan review should come before the optional status review. But ultimately, we learned that ODFW leadership had made promises to the livestock industry and rural politicians that wolves would be delisted at this point. And it's notable at the time, wolves were far from recovered. At the end of 2015, there were 110 known wolves in the state. That's far less than the 1,400 or so that scientists say the state could support. Wolves also only occupied about 12% of the habitat that had been identified, which itself is already far less than what was here historically. And just, can you imagine if the state wanted to delist elk or salmon or any other species with a population of just 110? It just wouldn't happen. So despite the process clearly having a predetermined outcome, advocates for scientifically based wolf recovery and for 21st century values participated in the process in good faith. Despite over 25,000 comments from citizens, dozens of scientists, and a few laws that argued against delisting, a conflict-ridden and special interest-driven commission declared mission accomplished and delisted wolves anyway. There were some really dirty tricks that led to this, but perhaps for the best, we're not going to dive into that. In the end, though, by stubbornly refusing to do a meaningful and independent review of the delisting, and under an outdated plan, the agency was pretty clearly violating the law. So we took them to court again. And again, it seemed pretty clear that the agency, ODFW, had violated the letter and spirit of the law. But rather than defend themselves in court on the merits, ODFW worked with politicians, industry, and some of Governor Brown's staff on this really shady political deal that, sort of following the model of that federal delisting, would shield the decision from judicial review. Though the shenanigans led to ethics complaints and even the resignations and firing of people involved, including Governor Brown's own staff, in the end, the legislature made a deal to stop a Republican walkout. Heard that story before. And Governor Brown passed a law declaring an emergency and retroactively saying that the ODFW decision was legal. A court ultimately said the law effectively blocked judicial review, and they never bothered to look at the merits of the case. And as I mentioned, we glossed over lots of details about wolves and focused on policy here, but make no mistake, policy matters and has real world consequences. Just after Governor Brown signed the bill, OR4 and what remained of his pack were killed. And as the wolf wearing a collar, OR4 would have been the last to be killed and had to endure being chased by a helicopter while watching his mate and 2 yearlings get killed. And speaking personally, I'll allow that the circumstances of that killing may have been one of the few times that killing wolves had some justification, but I wouldn't say that about the killings that have followed. And I certainly never expected the state and ODFW to fall so low that they would justify gunning down pups from a helicopter as they did this year. So with that, I want to turn it over to Danielle, who's going to take us to where we are now.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah. There you go. Hold on a second. This always takes a minute. Great. Can everyone see my screen for the presentation anyway?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Moser. I'm the Wildlife Program Coordinator for Oregon Wild. Thanks, Rob, for laying the foundation, giving us sort of that longer history of wolves in the state. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Like Rob said, I think, this presentation might be a little bit drier than some of the ones we've done, but I will get to why we wanted to have this and really walk through all of these different details with you all, because there is a good opportunity right now in front of us. So I'll kind of pick up where Rob left off, starting in about 2015 and bring us to today. But before I do that, I always like to just give the audience a sense of our wildlife program. And Rob gave me a great segue, because he was talking about the fact that we really do work on a lot of policies and sort of systems that influence decisions around wildlife. And that, while I love my time outdoors and on our wolf rendezvous and putting up trail cameras, a huge focus for myself and Allie and Rob is really making sure that we have decision makers in place, we have systems in place, we have policies in place that ensure that all species in the state are able to thrive. Because as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, there's a lot of special interest always pushing back on that. So yeah, a lot of my time is spent, whether it's with the Fish and Wildlife Commission or at the state legislature. But like Rob said, make no mistake, we really do care about all these species, and just there's a deep passion from our wildlife program, even if what we talk about a lot is seemingly boring policy. So let's get going. So to conserve or not to conserve, I do feel like this is always the question I have before me, and what I'm constantly pushing back against. And obviously Rob just covered the 2015 delisting, so I won't cover that, and the HB 4040, which was that state legislation that Governor Brown signed, which essentially blocked judicial review. So now I'm going to start to focus on what happened between 2017 to 2019, or as I like to call it, the longest years of my life, because this was when we were now finally updating or reviewing and updating the wolf conservation and management plan. And honestly, I could do an entire webinar just on this alone. And so there are a lot of details, and I'm going to pretty much go through them quickly. But I do want to touch on some of the highlights of, of this review because it has a lot of impact now. I think the thing to remember, and Rob pointed it out, which is, especially as we have federal protections from the Endangered Species Act coming and going, we have state protections coming and going. This is really the document that drives all decisions for ODF&W when it comes to wolf management and recovery. So what is in this matters a lot. And in 2017, we really got the ball rolling with this. Let's just say there was essentially 2 different stakeholder processes. It was long, it was arduous. The first iteration, it had sort of ODFW as the facilitator, which we pushed back and said, they are a stakeholder. They cannot be neutral. They have an opinion. They clearly are going to guide this in a particular direction. We need independent facilitators to drive it. There's just a lot more to this. And like I said, I could spend a lot of time on it. So unfortunately, I'm not going to, but if you have specific questions about this whole process, do email me. But essentially, the big bad wolf plan is what we got. So relating to phases 2 and 3, which was really the big crux of what we were focused on, because as Rob said, sort of that phase 1 portion was dealt with in that settlement in 2012. And so we were really looking at phases 2 and 3, which for wolves in Eastern Oregon, they were in phase 3, so this mattered a lot. And unfortunately, as hard as we pushed, we only could get approval for a threshold of 2 instances of predation in 9 months, meaning once they hit that threshold, the agency can consider moving to lethal or even deputizing the livestock operator or other members of the public to kill wolves. So it's a really low bar. Just to give some comparison, phase 1 is 4 instances of predation in 6 months. So again, as Rob said, it's not necessarily the best standard, but it was definitely much more improved. There was much more clarity and transparency and accountability and all the things that we wanted, and less ambiguity with that. Unfortunately, on that path of more ambiguity, we got relaxed requirements around non-lethal measures that were expected to be used before the agency could consider consider killing wolves. It's not to say that ODFW has just completely thrown out the window doing any non-lethal. They definitely, I think, still expect that. But again, to Rob's point, there's just a lot more discretion. They don't have to document it and, kind of show the public in communications, maybe as detailed. So there's a little bit less for us to hold them accountable on. We usually, if you look at the depredation reports, they're usually just like a couple sentences like, yep, a producer did X, Y, and Z. It's a much harder thing to really track and again, have that be defensible. And then finally, it opened the door to public hunting and trapping in a future year. And I want to be clear, there is no general hunting of wolves in Oregon right now. They even explicitly put in language, the commission did rather, that says this is not allowed right now. But the reason we talk about this is sort of the opening of the door is because from our perspective and having watched what other states did, we think that first step is when you deputize members of the public to kill wolves on behalf of either ODF&W or on behalf of livestock operators, because it's getting sort of people comfortable with this idea that any person really could go out and kill wolves. And so for us, that is that sort of that cracking open of the door. And then that's when you start to, later on have more and more proposals to again, expand and expand and expand trophy hunting. So, we didn't support this plan. If you followed us, we, criticized it harshly. And this quote that you see on my presentation is actually something that the governor's communications person said, presumably on the governor's behalf, after the wolf plan was finalized and voted on. And it was incredibly frustrating because all along the way, we were looking to her to set sideboards. We didn't expect her to come down and say, yes, no to every particular policy, but we at least hoped that she could set sort of a vision for the wolf plan, and we couldn't get her to do that. But then we got this quote after the fact, which was definitely too little, too late. And then just, so after 2019, I want to give you a sense of, how were wolves doing, around that time. And I guess it's not that long ago, although now since COVID, 2020 seems like 100 years ago, but also yesterday. So the agency conducts an annual wolf report where they count how many wolves are out there. They track how many packs and breeding pairs and all the different things you can see in this presentation. And they do this every year, which is helpful just to see how's it going out there, to give us a sense of progress. So for our 2020 report, there were 173 known adult wolves. I will say that's a more conservative exact number, whereas I think a lot of folks who are doing populations, they're more estimates, they're sort of extrapolating, but for Oregon, they have to actually track it, have a photo of it, have it collared and have, GPS data on a wolf in order to count it for this count. So it is the sort of minimum count, but even with that said, still pretty low on the grand scheme of things. 22 packs in the state, 17 breeding pairs, although that went down. 2019, it was 19 pairs, I believe. So we saw some fluctuation there. To me, this is probably the most alarming number that I tend to track a lot, which is that, of the 9 wolf mortalities in 2019 to 2020, 4 of them were from poaching. That is and still remains one of the biggest impediments to wolf recovery across our country. And so it's something that Oregon Wild and our partners are really working to try to address, because that is just persistent and it's really a big problem. Something to note for 2019 to 2020, ODFW did not kill any wolves, which, is great for sure, and something to celebrate. Just to give you some perspective, in the last month and a half, they have killed 8 wolves, I believe, already this year. So, while 0 was great, it's not something that we see every single year. That's definitely not the normal, at least in our experience. And then there were 31 confirmed depredations, which I believe was also quite an increase from the previous year. I think the previous year was like 17. So just want to give that snapshot. Also, here is, and I think Rob also had one of the areas of known wolf activity map. I think it's great so you can kind of see the distribution. I always like to just share with people, at least when I look at that, and maybe this is just sort of the human brain processing this map, I always think, oh my gosh, there's wolves everywhere. Like if you look at this map in the way they do these sort of blobs, it makes it look like, which is great, that wolves are like almost, just across that kind of arc into the northeast corner. But really that could be just a small pack or one wolf. That's just the whole sort of range in which they think that those wolves are moving. So because that map seems to, I don't know, for some reason resonate with me. That's like, and I think others have been like, see, our wolves are doing fine, like based on that map. And it's just not the right representation. So, and it is interesting because, 173 known wolves. I think what's fascinating is I talked to some people, who think we have thousands of wolves in the state. And I definitely talk to people who don't even realize we have any wolves in the state. So we're somewhere right in between that, I guess, closer to the 0 than the thousands, but just wanted to give you all that snapshot. And then here is the sort of overlay of management, both from the state and the federal level. This map's a little confusing. You kind of really need to like focus on it and understand the key here, but essentially that red line going down the middle is the state boundary, or not the state boundary, the state management boundary for dividing Western and Eastern Oregon. As you can see, wolves in Western Oregon are still in that phase 1. That means, again, just thinking of that depredation threshold, it's 4 and 6 months. And then wolves in Eastern Oregon, the eastern half of the state, they're in phase 3. And then, like Rob said, we had state delisting, which did affect all corners of the state. There weren't just little segments or anything like that. And then finally, from the federal perspective, and again, this was 2019, 2020, that eastern third, you can see that kind of beige is where that federal delisting happened in 2011. And then all that sort of striped side was where wolves were federally listed up and until not that long ago. So in 2020, the Trump administration, and as Rob pointed out, and quite frankly, there's just been so many attempts to undermine wolf recovery and remove protections since the second they returned to Idaho and Montana and so forth. And they're not always successful. There's a lot of attempts and we are able to stop a lot of them. Unfortunately, the Trump administration in 2020 was able to push through a remaining delisting proposal that is now the law of the land. And so it affects all the rest of the wolves in the lower 48. I think the only exception are the red wolves in the southeast part of our country, but that's a separate subspecies anyway. So that now for Oregon, that means that wolves were federally delisted in that sort of western 2/3 of the state. And then here's a quote from our coalition, it's press release. And I just, again, I want to show that this really went against not only, how the public felt about this, of course, but even members of Congress, Jane Goodall, veterinarians and other scientists. And it just, it was really not scientifically sound. One of the sort of litmus tests, I think, when we think about the Endangered Species Act, when we think about recovery is, have they recovered throughout a significant portion of their historic range? That's one of the gauges that we use to determine if a species, is ready to come off the list. And while, what we see in Idaho and Montana and the Great Lakes states is definitely something to celebrate, there's no way we can say they are returned throughout this significant portion of their historic range. I mean, I think California only has 3 wolf packs. We obviously only have, what is it now, 1 technically in Western Oregon. So there's a lot of room to go before we can say, like Rob said, mission accomplished. So I just want to do another timeline recap. And I don't mean to just be a broken record, but we're about to get into, again, these sort of the delineation of these different protections. And so I just want to be as clear as possible. So again, in 2011, we had wolves removed from the federal endangered species list. That was Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and then Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington. In 2015, we had wolves removed from the state endangered species list. That was statewide. And then 2020, 2021, I put 2021 because that was when it went into effect. Was January, I think January 5th of 2021. And that was the remaining lower 48 states, lost wolf protections, which included all of that Western Oregon. Since then too, we have seen, and this is really just the root of the problem. And again, I feel like a broken record saying, and Rob said, but just this idea that now individual states are driving management decisions. And, on the one hand, that could be good, but on the other hand, and in our experience, that's not going very well. And, one of the reasons to have the federal government, which of course we can be critical of too, but you sort of have that uniformity in management, and they obviously have, jurisdiction across the entire country. And there's a little bit more sort of synergy in that wolf recovery process and plan, as opposed to sort of these popcorn states doing what they want. I'm sure many of you have seen the just horrendous things that have been happening in the last, gosh, I want to say years, but it's really so much of it's happened just this year alone. Wisconsin, for example, since wolves were delisted in January, I mean, they had a wolf hunt and blew through a quota and broke tribal treaties, and it's just heinous. And then we have, like you can see in this presentation right now, Idaho, and I still am having a hard time wrapping my head around how this is possible, but passed a law saying that the state can kill up to 90% of their wolf population. I mean, it's mind blowing that anybody could think this is a legit thing to do in this day and age. And that is just, in addition to just a horrendous and quite frankly a slaughter of the state's wolf population. I mean, every methodology is in play. They're now paying out bounties. If you turn in a dead wolf, you're getting money. I mean, this is how we got on the path to extinction in the 19th and 20th centuries. Montana similarly has expanded the methods that you can use when you're hunting for wolves. You can bait traps, you can do night hunting, you can use neck snares. I mean, these things hadn't been used. These are methods that have not been used, at least in regards to their wolf plan and their wolf laws, hunting regulations. And it's just horrendous. I'm trying to find another abhorrent. I mean, I'm kind of at a loss of words of the fact that this is being allowed. And I think in particular, it just so undermines this idea of fair chase and ethical hunting. And you know, there's definitely some hunting groups stepping out saying, oh gosh, no, like we don't support this. This gives us a bad name, of course, for those who especially are actually ethical hunters. But by and large, like this is just, you know, it's a wolf slaughter. It's not even a hunt. And then what we have in Eastern Oregon with, and Rob mentioned the killing of the wolf pups out of the Lookout Mountain Pack in, you know, what was it, a month and a half ago. You know, it's not to say wolf pups never get killed when they're carrying out a kill order or lethal removal order, but to lead and to start off with killing wolf pups, it's disturbing and quite frankly unscientifically founded. You know, the agency tried to say, well, we're doing this to try to reduce the caloric needs of the pack. That is not a scientifically proven thing that, you know, the hunters of the pack are going to go, okay, so head count, I see we have less, so we're going to kill less livestock today. I mean, it's just, it's really, it's just shocking to say the least. And quite frankly, it didn't work. And that's exactly what Rob said. You know, usually when you're killing wolves, it's not going to lead to a better situation. It usually leads to more conflict. The other thing too is that, you know, even this justification that we're killing wolves to stop, you know, depredations and livestock losses. I mean, the argument about the pups is that, especially for the ones in Eastern Oregon, I mean, they weren't even part of the hunts yet. They were hanging out at the rendezvous sites and not even weaned yet from their mother. So it's just, all of these kinds of things are what we're starting to see circulate as a result of not having federal ESA protections and allowing states to just carry out whatever they want to do. And so this frankly is what has led to and where we are now, and why you probably joined this webinar to finally hear what we're talking about, which is that, you know, many of the wildlife conservation organizations submitted an emergency listing petition. They said, you know, what's going on in Montana and Idaho this cannot continue. They're going to wipe out their wolf population. So we need an emergency listing. Unfortunately, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service denied the emergency petition, but they did say, okay, we are going to conduct a 12-month status review and, you know, really look at whether wolves warrant being relisted, specifically from that sort of northern Rocky Mountain population, because that's the ones we're talking about right now. Excuse me. And, you know, I'm sure many of you are like thinking, I can't believe they would deny an emergency petition. And I totally hear you. And, you know, we feel very similarly. But I do want to just share the perspective that I think many of us thought they would just deny the petition outright without conducting any status review. So it's kind of feeling like we got that, like, here's a little give, but not the full. And so folks and individuals and organizations are definitely still, when we're submitting comments, say, hey, we need you to speed this up and do this now before Idaho actually can carry out killing 90% of their population. So that's where we are. So I just want to clarify this for the last time, because I understand we've again been talking about all these different protections for different sets of wolves. So I want to be crystal clear, or clear as Crater Lake. So the wolves in Eastern Oregon, those are the ones that are currently being reviewed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for relisting. Then the wolves in Western Oregon, those are the ones that the Trump administration removed from the list earlier this year, or I guess technically end of last year. That is, we have pending litigation in court, because I know a lot of folks are curious, like, can't we get all of these wolves relisted? The answer is eventually, eventually, and we obviously that's what we're trying to do, but there is a distinction between these two sets of wolves for around the country, and especially within Oregon, which is really frustrating that we have, and same with Washington, that we have sort of this dividing line, I guess, so to speak. But I just want to be clear again about where we are and what wolf population I'm talking about tonight. And the other thing I will say is the wolves in Western Oregon and that pending litigation, that is more tied to like what's happening in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan. That's related to that delisting earlier this year. Whereas again, the stuff happening in Idaho and Montana is more directly associated with that, the wolves in Eastern Oregon and that particular administrative rule and procedures. So I apologize if that's incredibly confusing. I did my best to try to clarify that. So where are we now? Well, of course, we're going to ask you all to submit a public comment to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, asking them to relist wolves as soon as possible. You can go directly to the government's website and submit a comment if you want additional talking points. If you want to see, our public comments letter that I sent it out in an email alert on Monday, you can go to Oregon Wild right there. You can see it on the presentation for suggested talking points. Feel free to submit that form letter that we've put together. But I do think it's important if you can customize your own letter, make it unique, personalize it. That just always helps because I do think, it's important that we submit those sort of boilerplate letters that I put together and many Oregon Wild staff do as well. But it's definitely better if, there's at least an email subject change or, just again, a little bit different language always helps. So, I think this was just the right theme for this week. It's Wolf Awareness Week. We know you all out there who are listening tonight care tremendously about our wolves, as do we. And so, we're hoping you can take the awareness you have tonight and really turn it into action, tell friends and family. And I just want to end by saying, we can't do this work that we do without you all. We obviously are doing what we can in the courts. We're doing what we can with policy. But at the end of the day, if we don't have a huge groundswell of the public, weighing in saying that this is not okay, we don't have these protections for wildlife. So thank you to you all for what you do. And if you have additional questions after this presentation, feel free to email me, but let's get to questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Rob and Danielle, for that great presentation and to help clarify the situation. So someone asked for some wolf pictures, so I'll put those up really quick. But in the meantime, Rob, if you could clarify why it would be the correct thing to kill OR4. You mentioned that in your presentation, so if you could just clarify that a bit more.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of glad that got asked because as soon as I said it, I was thinking that could get misinterpreted. I wouldn't say it was right, but I guess what I was trying to say is that at least there was some rational justification in a way that there has generally not been in other cases. So a little background on that: up until 2016, OR4 and the Amnaha pack had defended just this huge territory, and OR4 was basically a geriatric wolf. And when one of the younger wolves, OR33, left the pack to disperse and start a pack of his own, OR4, this geriatric wolf, was left with a female mate with 3 working legs and 2 yearlings. And I think they were likely, up until that time, they were able to sort of defend that territory because all of the packs around that area were his direct offspring. And there was plenty of territory that there was no need to go attack dad. But then in 2016, some new wolves usurped that pack, and the pack moved on in a very weakened shape in a place that had tons of livestock and far less wild prey, and also at a time, I believe, that calving and lambing was happening. And in this rare case, the agency and the local livestock producers seem to have done a lot, really, to use all the non-lethal measures that they could to prevent more conflict. But due to the state of the pack, the predation on livestock didn't seem like it was going to stop, and killing wolves was the only way to do that. I would suggest that in a natural system, a weakened or displaced pack like that would have just starved to death. They would have been kicked to death by an elk or killed by other wolves. But because there was this sort of easier prey base, they were going on livestock. Folks want more of my personal thoughts on the matter. You can look up a blog. We have a eulogy for OR4 on our website. I don't read it anymore out loud because it makes me cry. So, make no mistake, this is not something I celebrate, but it at least had some justification. And the circumstances here are not what we've seen in other kill orders. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Rob. Okay, I'll go to this question next. What is the deadline for the comments?
Sorry, I was looking through the many questions coming in now. So I was trying to, which ones are we going to get to answer? So this is a 12-month status review. So technically comments can go for 12 months. So it's open the whole time. And this rule was initiated on September 17th. So, but I would ask that you do it sooner, and really with that message that we need them to do this much sooner than 12 months. But technically you have a year, or I guess less than 11 months now.
Okay, good to know. So the next question is, wolves' ranges overlap state boundaries. If you could comment on how our bordering states' wolf policies affect Oregon wolf packs, that would be great, like Idaho, anywhere else.
Rob, it's interesting. I wrote an email once in which I was talking about what Idaho is doing and how that impacts Oregon. And I think generally that's going to be true because our source population tends to come from Idaho. But I can't say with certainty, like, yes, this wolf has come over and this wolf has come over, at least in recent years. As Rob pointed out, we've definitely knew that, I think, more historically. But make no mistakes, for sure, wolves don't respect state boundaries. So they're going up to Washington, coming back down. Obviously, some of ours are going to California. You're welcome, California. And so I think that's why, especially what's happening in Idaho is so particularly offensive and directly impacting, it could directly impact Oregon. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, that's right. Yeah, all those are true. And I think Danielle's point is right, that actually in a lot of ways, what's happening here might matter more to California these days. But, I mentioned that there were these sort of politically negotiated minimum recovery numbers. And that's what everybody points to. Well, Idaho's way above that. We can manage them right back down to something like 110 wolves. And there's some real question of whether that's really a viable population. And we are a small enough population that we are still dependent upon those dispersals from Idaho. And I think one of the concerns there is just genetic diversity. A lot of these wolves, I think all of the wolves that have been genetically tested in Oregon share genetics with those couple dozen wolves that were reintroduced into central Idaho. So until we truly genetically reconnect a sizable enough population of wolves here in Oregon, all the way to those bigger populations up even in Canada, what happens here really matters. We have not, I think, Danielle made the point, we would celebrate an appropriate delisting of wolves where wolves had recovered and the state plans that were in place would ensure that the populations would sustain themselves over time. That's just not the current situation. And so, until that changes, it's appropriate that wolves maintain these protections.
Great. I think this is a really good question. Have you seen a difference in livestock owner attitude for or against non-lethal strategies? And then is there a regional difference that you've observed?
Can I jump on that, Danielle? Yeah, I think, we often talk about folks like in this monolithic, like ranchers feel this way, environmentalists feel this way. And I think it's important to know that, there's a lot of diversity within all of these different communities. And it's really unfortunate. Wolves really sort of picked one of the worst places socially, politically that they could have come to in Oregon, even the specific livestock allotments where they found themselves. And so really the conversation about wolves started here where I live in Wallowa County, where people are really, really hostile to wolf recovery and any protections of wildlife or public lands, or at least that was the case a lot more 10 years ago. I think it's starting to change. But we found that people in the community who were trying to do the right thing were getting bullied. Even to the point where on our very first wolf rendezvous, somebody who was going to come speak to us was a livestock manager, worked on ranches, and was told, if you talk to that group, you're not going to find work here again. And so we've seen that when wolves show up in other parts of the state, some of the people from where here who have demonstrated the worst possible example of husbandry to try to prevent conflict, and instead have done everything they can to try to justify killing wolves, are going and spreading the gospel of why you should do it differently. But there are people doing the right thing. They just tend to be quiet about it. And there's some great examples. Idaho has some great examples, like in the Wood River Valley, where livestock producers have truly done everything they can to prevent predation through non-lethal means. And what they've found is not only is it generally successful in that they're losing a lot less livestock to wolves, because wolves are such a small percentage of livestock losses, that better husbandry means that they're actually losing less livestock overall to all of these other causes, which is great. And you're actually seeing, though it's expensive, people argue you're actually on balance. It's more economical to do those things. And so there are differences regionally. I think as the conversation about wolves moves around, you find different conversations, but it has been frustrating to see that sort of everywhere wolves show up, we have to start the conversation from the beginning again, where it's all the wolf myths and misinformation. And then things settle down and we realize that they didn't drive anybody out of business. Kids are still safe. There's still deer and elk out there to hunt, and things calm down. It doesn't ever go away. But then people start to figure out how to adjust. And I think that's really, that's where I hope that we can get to over time.
Great. Danielle, we have a few questions about just the links that you had on your presentation. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and maybe you could pop that slide back up so people can see it for the rest of the time.
Okay, I'll get that going. Do you want to get another question, Ron?
Yeah. And then let's see. Do you know the current number of wolves in Western Oregon?
I just pulled up our spreadsheet that Rob has started many years ago, and the last count had 22 wolves in Western Oregon, but the challenge is there was only one identified breeding pair. So that was the part that was alarming for us.
Okay.
Four packs, but only one identified breeding pair.
Gotcha. Okay. And then next question, are there any new effective wolf deterrents being utilized to safeguard livestock?
Yeah, although I would note that the most effective one is probably the oldest one, which is to say human presence. Cowboys doing cowboy things, not turning your cows loose for days, weeks, months at a time and hoping they're all going to be safe out there. Human presence is one of the best deterrents. But there's also some really cool stuff that folks are doing. Biofencing, which is basically fencing with scents that might keep wolves out. All sorts of different things. People use livestock guardian dogs, which can be effective in certain situations, and when used properly. Used improperly, they can make situations worse. Some people are moving their livestock in different ways, keeping them together as a herd, having more experienced animals out there, having cattle with horns. There's all sorts of ways that are old and new. There's some interesting ideas, especially for when livestock are kept in close. Fox lights, which are basically these lights that flash in a random way and keep animals away. Wolves are smart though, and they get habituated to certain things. But it's impressive how when people are truly using these methods that have been proven, how effective they really are. More often than you hear a lot of people saying we're doing all this stuff, and then when ODFW puts out the report on what were the non-lethals that were used, I think there was 1-2 years or so ago, and the non-lethal tool that was being used was trail cameras. And it's like, what are trail cameras doing? And this is a rancher who's saying, I'm doing everything I can non-lethally to keep these wolves out. It doesn't work. We got to shoot them. I'm not sure how a trail camera really helps. But there are a lot of really effective tools out there, and none of them solve every problem. And we have to keep trying to learn. And similarly, not everything that works in one place is going to work in the other place. And again, quite frankly, using things in the wrong way actually will make the problem worse. It'll make those tools much less effective, which is why it was so frustrating to see in Wallowa County some of the most effective tools, one of which is called flattery, this red tape on fences being used not to keep wolves away, but to delineate different pastures for cows. So the wolves are just going past them and it loses its effectiveness. And those sorts of things make things worse. But there are a lot of different tools. I think Living with Wolves is a good website where you can find some of that. And there's some others as well.
Allie, if folks are okay, we could probably stay on 5 more minutes max. We tend not to like to go too far past when our webinar is for, but I would say maybe we ended at 7:05 and just take a few more questions. If that
I agree. There's a lot of questions coming in, so I'm fine with that. Let's see. Are there any public geospatial data sets related to the travels of specific tracked wolves that people could take a look at?
ODFW has that information, and we would personally rather that not get out very wide. So even sometimes with those maps that I showed you, and sometimes when they show a much closer up map, we're like, let's not, because as you saw, that poaching is really a top problem. And obviously, I don't know you, whoever asked that question, I assume you wouldn't be out trying to poach the animal, but unfortunately, there are too many people that's what they would be using it for. So.
For what it's worth, a very cool place to go, though, is if you're on Facebook, go to the Voyageurs Wolf Project website, and they have some really cool, they call them ball and string maps of where wolves are traveling in northern Minnesota. And it's actually really cool to see how they're kind of using the landscape there. But yeah, Danielle's right. They don't exist for us to see, and that's just as well.
Yep, makes sense. And then this is somewhat related. If we think we got, this person's asking, if they think they got a wolf on a trail camera outside of known wolf ranges in Western Oregon, who should they tell or get confirmation, or should they just keep it a secret?
I'd say do what you feel is right. There is a place on the ODFW website where you can report them. And I think it comes down to your trust level and what the agency will do with that information. And there have been times where I've said, you should absolutely post this. And then there's other times when it's really hard to tell somebody to tell ODFW where there's a wolf when you know that they're going to go out, collar it, and they're going to use that collar to probably kill the pack at some point, or to, only find dead livestock rather than to actually monitor wolves strictly from a scientific standpoint or to prevent conflict. So that's a really hard question to answer. Yeah, I don't know, Danielle, if you have other thoughts.
No, I mean, the flip side is it's always fun to celebrate new wolves returning to historic range, and I don't know, re-entering old habitat, I guess, so to speak. So, that's always a fun, like, obviously there are books literally written about Journey going into California. So, we get excited. But yeah.
And I kind of feel like a wolf that's out there doing its own thing quietly and unknown means it's not getting into trouble. And part of me, because collars are a mixed bag and all this stuff. And we could do a whole webinar on that. There's some positives of it, but there's also some real big negatives. So it's a tough question.
Okay. I think I have time for a few more questions. Have any members of the public been deputized to kill wolves yet?
Oh, yes. And I think to Danielle's earlier thing, I would say Oregon has had wolf hunts. Citizens being able to go out with their rifle and shoot a wolf, that sounds an awful lot like a wolf hunt to me. And in a couple cases, when there have been kill orders, the agency has deputized the livestock owners to in turn deputize other members of their family, friends, whatever, to go kill wolves. And so we've got, out-of-state cousins of a livestock owner who can come from, hey, you want to go on a wolf hunt, Iowa cousin? Come on out. I got a kill permit. And if we see a wolf, we can go kill it. And that's happened. I don't know if it's specifically Iowa, but that has happened. And furthermore, something that's really, really egregious is that ODFW nominally to stop or to prevent predation does share wolf location information with livestock owners. And furthermore, they also, as part of the non-lethal program, provide tools for the range riders and for livestock producers that include telemetry equipment to find wolves. ATVs to ride around, shotguns, all of these different things. And there's no, even though that's part of the taxpayer non-lethal program, they can give their cousin from Iowa that telemetry equipment to go out and find the wolf on the state-sponsored ATV to go shoot that wolf. So to me, that's the state deputizing wolf hunting, even if it's not an open season as such. We've already had wolf hunting in Oregon.
Yeah. And on that note, I mean, I think you guys have made it pretty clear that wolves definitely need our help. So please do submit that public comment. It's really important to help protect wolves in Oregon. And I know this was kind of a not so fun presentation, but also very necessary. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And it is past 7:05, so I'm gonna wrap it up now. Thank you, Rob and Danielle.
Thanks, Allie, for emceeing. I did see there were a couple of questions just about the raffle and if they could, like, where do people buy the items? So I don't know, Allie, if you want to just remind folks one more time. I saw a few different questions related to that.
Yeah, so the raffle will be open for all of tonight. So you can do that at any time. And you can navigate to that by going to OregonWild.org. And then on the homepage, you'll see a tab for hikes and events. And if you click the Unpacking the Status of Oregon Wolves link, then you can go to the sign up and then hit any of the raffle tickets that you want to buy. And they're $5 a piece. So yeah, please do that if you want. We have some special prizes and it does help us continue doing these presentations and bringing about some awareness. Excuse me, I can't talk right now. Bringing about some awareness for these issues. So yeah, thank you all for joining us and have a good night.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.